atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, attorney and former deputy assistant to President Trump, May Mailman.
Hey, Mike.
Hey, May, how are you this morning?
I am great. How are you?
I'm doing okay now. Well, we're still working through the rest of what I guess I'll call Independence Day weekend, which is a little rough on our dogs because when 4th of July is like a Thursday or a Friday, people have those leftover fireworks and our dogs are not crazy about it. So it's been a few rough nights, but aside from that, I'm good.
I know. And I feel like, I don't know if fireworks have always been this late, but they were at 11 p.m. last night in Cleveland. But earlier in the week, maybe like a Tuesday at 1 a.m.,
yes,
there was some sort of crazy amount of fireworks. What are people doing at 1 a.m.?
I don't even know. It's clearly a breakdown of the social order, so, but yeah, the exact same thing we're dealing with. Thankfully, this year, we were able to give our dogs some peanut butter, CBD, cannabinoid edibles. I don't know, but they work and they work better than anything else. So thankfully, it's not quite as crazy. But I got to say, over the last few days, I'm working on maybe a little bit less sleep and a little bit more caffeine than I normally have been. So we'll see how that translates into our discussions today.
As a mom of a 14-week-old who is still not sleeping through the night, to be fireworks woken up and then baby woken up is particularly offensive.
Oh, I can only imagine. Oh, gosh. we will get through this here and then maybe, I don't know, take a nap or something. But let's start with the story I think everyone is talking about. And that is, of course, President Biden and his whether he will or will not end up dropping out or being forced from the race. And of course, last week, Jay and I discussed the immediate fallout from that disastrous debate performance. And I think there's been some time now for the dust to settle. We've seen a few early post-debate polling come in from more than a few pollsters. And, for top Democrats, big donors, and the Biden camp to consider what they want to do next. And it seems pretty clear to me that what initially was a trickle of concern has grown, actually, which is exactly what the Biden administration was hoping wouldn't happen. And I don't see that changing at all after that 22-minute interview that the president sat for with George Stephanopoulos on Friday, because it seemed like an exercise in denial and delusion. He said no one was more qualified for the presidency than he is. He denied being frail. He disputed the polls. He refused to take an independent neurological and cognitive exam. And he said that only the Lord Almighty could convince him to stand down. So there you go. That seems pretty definitive. May, I'm wondering, what's the reaction on the right to all of this?
I guess we'd like to run against Biden, so go Biden, go. But it's kind of one of those things that I've always judged the Democrats who kept trying to boost Trump in the primary because they'd rather run against Trump, even though they felt as though Trump was some horrible threat to democracy, which I definitely disagree with. But shouldn't you want your opponent to at least be capable of being president? So I guess I kind of feel like that, which is I do want Biden to be the candidate. He's very beatable, but I don't think he's capable of being president. And so that's kind of how I feel. But I do want to talk about this George Stephanopoulos interview. Denial is, I guess, one way to put it, but the way that he spoke was so confident and so forceful in that denial that I genuinely don't understand it. Like, if I were to say something stupid on this show, I would be thinking about it for 2 weeks. And yet Biden can go out in front of America and have I don't even care about the debate performance. It is years years of cognitive decline. And yet he seems to not get it at all. And so my question is, does he really not get it? Is he that stupid that he doesn't understand what's going on with his brain? Like, is he that stupid, or is he sociopathic and that he has convinced himself? He has in his mind just told himself, I am smart. I am the best. I am good president. Like, is it, I don't understand, Mike. I watched that interview and I did not understand.
Yeah, I would say it's not stupid or sociopathic. I think it's sadly all too common. I think about, for instance, Ruth Bader Ginsburg hanging on for too long, or Strom Thurmond, or in the sports world, Michael Jordan's last season with the Wizards, or the late career of Muhammad Ali. There are just so many examples of figures who were formidable in their prime, who just, I think the human capacity for self-delusion is almost endless, and it has nothing to do with how smart one is. And it's, of course, the stakes are so much higher when you're talking about a heavyweight boxer or a basketball player, but the president, or even a Supreme Court justice, but the president of the United States, or a potential president. And so to me, he heard the message and he interpreted it as, well, you have to be more stronger and more forceful. And that was him doing that. But at the same time, I think it comes across to, at least to me, and I think a lot of people in the party, as a man who is denying reality. And I think that actually there was something that he could have done that would have calmed fears. Because I was thinking about saying, at this point, is there anything that he could have done? And I think there is. If he would have gone into that interview and said, listen, I know I'm behind. I know that debate hurt me. I have lost a step or two, but the same is true of Donald Trump. And hey, I'm here to tell you that I'm willing to undergo independently administered neurological and cognitive testing if Donald Trump agrees to do the same thing. And we will release those results publicly. I think that would have been just about the only thing he could have done that would have stopped the bleeding here. And I think the reason he didn't do that is because he or the people around him know what would happen if he underwent independently administered neurological and cognitive testing, and it wouldn't be good. So that's my takeaway on that. What do you think?
I guess, but I don't think there's anything he could have done, because he's going to make another gaffe tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day. He's going to talk to a dead foreign leader. He's going to forget what year it is. It's endless. And that's why actually I was very confused. So I didn't watch the debate in real time. I had to watch it a few hours afterward because I was at an event. And so my husband texts me and he's like, oh my gosh, this is so terrible. Like, look at Twitter, look at CNN, this is so terrible. When I watched the debate, yeah, Biden said we beat Medicare. That's pretty embarrassing. That's pretty bad. He's like, his voice is weak. He looks confused. But nothing to me was out of the ordinary. This was the same President Biden, in my opinion, that we have seen for years now, but certainly a year. And I guess I'm confused of why everybody is snowballing right now, because you've known this is not an unknown thing. And so it was always going to be the case, I think, that everyone ended up rallying around Biden, because maybe some people use the debate as an opportunity to restart this conversation, but this has been an available conversation for a very long time. It is not one that the DNC or the Bidens or anybody else has been willing to actually entertain. And so you soldier on. And so there was the George Stephanopoulos interview, whether it allayed fears or not, is irrelevant. Like, this is the choice and we're doing it anyway. And so my theory is the Democrats just need to do what they can to save down ballot races, hope that it's a 4 years of just standstill, and push the restart button in 4 years.
Yeah, initially I thought that there was going to be no way that Biden, there would be very slim possibility of President Biden announcing he would, not seek re-election. But now I'm starting to wonder, because you mentioned the down ballot races, and now there's a lot of talk about what some on the left have called a MAGA trifecta, where, because initially the thinking was, well, even if we potentially lose the White House, we're in a good position in the House, and we probably aren't going to keep the Senate, but at least we'll have something. And now I think there are a lot of House Democrats who are saying, I don't know now, which is why we've seen at this point now it's 4 House Democrats who've come out and called for the president to not seek re-election. I think there are going to be more. I don't know what's going to happen. There's that meeting that Hakeem Jeffries is going to be holding with Democrats, I believe, tomorrow. But it seems to me those calls are going to intensify. And I think that especially if this hits the donor class hard enough, and all of a sudden the Biden camp realizes that our money supply has been largely cut off, they're going to realize that it's just simply not tenable for him to stay in the race. And certainly maybe that's wishful thinking on my part, because right now it seems very clear to me that no matter what, Joe Biden has been weakened politically to the point where I do not see how he can possibly win. And so I think for Democrats, it's a choice between almost certainly losing with Joe Biden or probably losing with someone who's not Joe Biden. But one thing I know almost for certain is that Joe Biden will not be president of the United States in, February of 2025. I'm about 100% on that, I would say.
Yeah. And for a very long time, it's not that I didn't buy the polls. It's that I didn't think the polls translated to votes because the Democrats have such a robust ballot collection game, well-funded, well-organized, and the laws are all, at this point set up. So, and I still do feel that way in a sense, which is I think Democrats can overcome some of the polling just through brute force. But there is a point where that's no longer the case. And I just don't see young voters, minority voters, real core Democrat constituencies coming out for Joe Biden, or frankly, someone they don't know, like some replacement person, like Gavin Newsom. Like, does, you and I know who that is? Does a random college kid know who that is? I don't know. So yeah, it's not looking good for you guys. Sorry about that, Mike.
No, I think almost anyone who's been mentioned would be better than Joe Biden at this point. Even Kamala Harris, I think, would be, and certainly there's some polling now that suggests that she would do slightly better. And so at this point, I think, I don't know if it's going to happen. It certainly would be messy if it does happen. Sort of in my dream world, which would never happen, the Democrats say, who would be good? Andy Bashir, someone someone who's way too moderate to ever win in the primaries. Right? I think there was, I want to say Ross Douthat or somebody in the Times said, what about Joe Manchin? Like, well, there's somebody that the base would never go for. But I think there's this argument now saying that, well, if we don't have to worry about the primaries in the base, maybe we can get some sort of convention where we can get a moderate person who can sweep into office. I don't really buy that as being possible. But at this point, I'm almost resigned to the fact that Donald Trump will be the next president of the United States. I hope I'm wrong about that. But if I were a betting person, I would say that's highly likely. And so well, I guess before we move on this, do you get a sense that Democrats are going to find a way to force Biden from the, because what I'm hearing on the left is that then now it's not a question of, well, we're concerned he needs to prove himself, but now a lot of people are saying, well, we wanted to give him the chance to go out on his own terms, but now that he's not doing that, we're going to have to essentially force him out.
I think that the Democrats ride this ride as far as it goes. I just don't, I haven't seen the sort of forceful, committed effort or really a desire to do so. like I said, there were opportunities. I don't understand why the debate was a turning point. He has been like this for such a long time. And if there wasn't a coordinated effort before, then there won't be a coordinated effort now. I really,
Yeah, on that,
I don't see it happening.
on that, I think that makes I guess a little bit more sense to me, because I think Joe Biden was in reasonably good shape in 2020 and into 2021, and maybe things started to slip a little bit after that. But as you know, a presidential campaign is like is like some kind of ocean liner, right? It is a huge, massive thing. You have to launch it long before the actual election. This is years before. And so the momentum of the whole thing, especially when you have an incumbent who wants re-election, again, to me, it just goes back to not just the momentum of the thing, but the fact that it's so easy for people to believe what they want to believe and what's most convenient to believe. And the most convenient story is, hey, Joe Biden's president of the United States. He beat Donald Trump in 2020. He's shown he can win. He's going to do it again. And that narrative now is crumbling. But now I think it's just a little bit too late, unfortunately. And
if there was an easy heir apparent, then I would say maybe still possible. But I remain convinced that Kamala Harris is the ultimate insurance policy. I don't think you can bypass her. I don't think she can win. So if you're going to lose with Joe Biden, and if you're going to lose with Kamala Harris, but if you pick Kamala Harris, then you piss off Gretchen Whitmer and Gavin Newsom, then just you keep Joe Biden. Like, it still is easier to just lose with Joe Biden than to lose with somebody else. And so I still think it's just figure out what you can do with Joe Biden. And in 2022, the down ballot races were just fine, even though Biden had really low approval ratings, not just for senility, but inflation and all the rest. So I don't know. I think it's still Joe.
I'm going to say that it won't be. I think something's going to break in the next week or two. And again, I understand there's probably more than a slight element of wishful thinking there, but we certainly will find out. Okay, May, so why don't we move from that to the apparent, I guess I've been told that Donald Trump, when he does, assuming he does win, he will now be a king above the law, I guess. I don't know. Why don't you kind of get us into that?
All right. So as we all know, Donald Trump is facing prosecution from special counsel Jack Smith for basically the alternate/fake electors plan. And President Trump challenged that he wanted to say absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for his official acts, for what's called in the outer perimeter of his official acts. And that notion of immunity was rejected at the DC District Court. It was rejected at the DC Circuit Court, and the Supreme Court accepted review. So as soon as the Supreme Court accepted review, every human being should have known that there was going to be some amount of immunity. Even the government at the oral argument said that there's some sort of immunity, and said that the DC Circuit Court's decision of there can't be immunity because the president committed a crime, and crimes are, the DC Circuit Court decision did not make any sense. So anyone with a brain should have known that some immunity was coming. And yet, if you turned on Twitter a few days ago, then you saw, oh my gosh, there's immunity. The president can kill his political rival. Where is this coming from? This is so crazy. Oh, Justice Sotomayor has decided in her dissent to say that some level of immunity from criminal prosecution means that presidents can kill whoever they want. Okay. Crazy. Crazy. Unhelpful. Not A, not correct. B, not useful for our political discourse. So here's what the Supreme Court actually said. Presidents, ex-presidents have long had immunity from civil liability. The question was whether there's more protections in the criminal process. You've got the grand jury process, there are sufficient safeguards that you feel comfortable with criminal liability moving forward, that the presidency will still be able to survive that. And basically, no, we've got separation of powers, meaning you can't have a legislature just make laws that criminalize things that a president does as president. So we are only talking about official acts. So for example, if a president were going to build a wall and someone were to trip and fall and die on that wall, there was already going to be civil immunity there. Now there is going to be criminal. You can't charge them for murder. Okay, it's not absolute immunity. So even for your official acts, for core presidential functions, like, for example, granting a pardon, that is absolute immunity. My understanding is even the government agrees with that. Then for non-core activities, so still things that you're doing officially as president, there's a presumption of immunity, but the government prosecuting an ex-president can show that prosecution would not interfere with the presidency moving forward. Okay, great. So in my opinion, this is not a super unexpected or particularly crazy decision. They did not really go through and parse what of Trump's activities were and weren't official, non-official, core, non-core, with the exception of a very few things. So Trump, when, after the aftermath of the 2020 election, was talking to his Department of Justice, wanting the Department of Justice to investigate various election fraud. Talking to your Department of Justice, asking them to investigate crime is a core presidential activity. And so you can't charge that discussion as a crime. Okay. Basically, besides that, we know that talking to your vice president is a presidential activity, but it's not a core presidential activity. So still, there could be some liability arising out of that. Justice Barrett didn't join the entire opinion. She felt as though you could use official activities as evidence of a crime, even if you couldn't charge official activities as the crime itself, but you could use it as evidence. And then Justice Sotomayor's dissent said that today the king is above the law. You can have SEAL Team 6 go and kill people with fear for our democracy. I dissent and all the rest. Of course, this doesn't make any sense to me at all. Name for me the official function of killing your political rival. You can't. It doesn't exist. And so all of these hyperbolic, fear-mongering, as Chief Justice Roberts called it, I thought was not based in reality and unhelpful. But I don't know, Mike, you couldn't have been surprised by this ruling, but what did you think?
Yeah, I wasn't surprised by it. I was surprised and disappointed by Sotomayor's dissent, which I felt was, I guess I'll call it reckless. And in that, I don't think that the chain of reasoning that she puts forward is crazy. That's one way to read the majority's opinion. And I think, though, that it's not a very careful or thoughtful reading of the majority's opinion. And as I read it, the majority was sort of torn in the sense, trying to strike a balance between ensuring that the president is not essentially hobbled or that presidential action isn't chilled by the threat of criminal prosecution. And that's reasonable. Certainly, that's the whole basis of Nixon versus Fitzgerald on civil prosecution. So I think that's reasonable. But on the other hand, I think that Justice Sotomayor, Justice Jackson, whose dissent I thought was a lot better than Sotomayor's, points out that, well, do we really need to, we need to make sure that, if a president is engaged in criminal acts, that president should be in some way held accountable. And I think the majority recognizes that, which is why they come out with this sort of three-part core outer perimeter unofficial sort of thing. And one way to read that is how Justice Sotomayor read it. Now, I read it as that the majority sort of gives itself an escape hatch, if you will. And they say at one point that, well, the president should be immune for prosecution for an official act unless the government can show that applying a criminal prohibition to the act would pose no dangers of intrusion on the authority and functions of the executive branch. And I think that to me is sort of the majority's escape hatch. And so, as in a real world sense, I find it almost impossible to see a scenario where Donald Trump, first off, or any president, right, calls up, well, he wouldn't call up SEAL Team 6, it's not like he has a number, right? Calls up some general or talks to some general and says, listen, I want you to assassinate this Democrat. And that general then gets in touch with a special op force, and they say, go ahead and do this. And all these people say, yeah, okay, that sounds good. The president's going to give us all pardons, even though it will destroy us if it comes out in a whole bunch of other ways. This happens, then it goes to court, and the Supreme Court says, oh, yeah, that's okay. They're going to find a way to say that's not okay. And I think they left that opening there. And so that's why I find that this reading is just way over the top. Now, I wouldn't have joined that majority opinion. I think at least that Justice Barrett makes a good point in saying that, well, listen, why can't, if you're going to charge the president or try to charge the president with something that involves the outer perimeter of his functions or an unofficial act, why can't you bring into evidence things that are related to his official acts? Now, what the majority says in response to that is that in a footnote that, no, we're not saying that you can't reference official acts. You just simply, because they're part of the public record, you just can't reference the White House communications that go on behind it. So you can't subpoena records of phone conversations or logs or things like that aren't normally public record. I agree with Justice Barrett that that's going a little bit too far. So I would strike the balance probably somewhere between where Justice Barrett and Justice Jackson did, and not nearly as far as, well, Jackson and Sotomayor are essentially agreed in one sense that, well, there should just be basically almost no immunity and the system will just work itself out. And this is not like that big of a deal. I'm not willing to go that far. But then again, I think there's this saying, and you're familiar with it, May, right? Hard cases make for bad law. And I think Donald Trump's kind of an example of this, because this is clearly the dissent was focused, especially sort of more a lot on Donald Trump. It's a Trump case. So I guess I wish that I understand what the majority is saying, and I get where they're going with that, but I think I would have been a little less, I would have gone a little less far on that balance than they did, I guess.
Yeah. And so the aftermath of this decision, I think obviously that's going to slow down Jack Smith, because now he's got to parse. It's not that there's no case, but he has to parse what you can present as evidence, what you can charge as a crime, what you can't. You're going to have a district court decide that can, this is just going to take a while now. And under the assumption that Trump is president, that, that's the end of the road there. So I really don't see, because you and I don't think that the Democrats are going to win the presidency, I do see this as the end of Jack Smith's case, essentially. But I think there's a question about how this affects other cases. So President Trump has said that in his New York hush money case, yes, that crime, which, I disagree that this is a crime, but falsifying business records in order to hide some election law violation, that's not an official act. Okay. But a lot of the evidence that came in, for example, from Hope Hicks, were private conversations that he had as president. And so now it's messy. Were some of those conversations official acts that should be given immunity even as evidence. And so the trial court there is going to have to consider that. Now, I don't really know how that's going to go, Mike, but it does seem to me a little bit like, why did they even bring Hopix in? I mean, some of this stuff was just not really sort of tied to what they needed to prove. So Alvin Bragg may have, I think, made his case more difficult than he needed to by just trying to get as many people to trash Donald Trump as possible as part of this case. But I still think that ultimately the core of that New York case is so outside of President Trump's official actions that while I don't think that it's a crime, like I think that case is stupid for other reasons, I don't think that this immunity decision is going to have a real effect there, minus a slight pause. But maybe you disagree.
Yeah, I'm a little less sure about that because I know that Judge Marchand postponed the sentencing to September 18th. And I believe at one point in his announcement about it, he said something like, if such is still necessary, right? Now that doesn't necessarily mean anything. It's giving the parties a chance to make their case why it shouldn't be overturned or vacated, I guess. But I guess when I think about sort of the case that was presented to get that conviction and the fact that there was some evidence, I don't know how comfortable I am if we follow that precedent now that the Supreme Court has set that, well, some of that should have been inadmissible. And I don't know that I'm comfortable with the judge saying, well, yeah, but it wouldn't have made a difference anyway. I tend to want to see the courts err on the side of giving the defendant the benefit of the doubt whenever possible. And that sometimes that means that defendant is someone who I do not personally like, right? But that doesn't matter. In fact, you can argue that those are especially the cases where the defendant should have the benefit of the doubt. And so I think there's a better chance that this conviction will be in some way vacated, overturned. And maybe I don't agree with the precedent. I think that if Justice Barrett had won the day with her argument, then it wouldn't be the issue. But I wouldn't be surprised if that were overturned. But at this point, I don't know how much it really matters for all the reasons we talked about. And, one other thing I wanted to mention on this day is it seems like in so many of these decisions now, even when Clarence Thomas is in the majority, he's got his own thing going on, right? And I've gotten sort of fond of reading his concurrences, and he's got one here where he argues that not only do I agree with the majority, but by the way, I don't even think that Jack Smith's office is constitutional. And his argument is that Congress has to specifically create all federal offices, and he doesn't believe that the Attorney General has the authority. Now, Garland says, well, it comes from legislation that says I can appoint officials to detect and prosecute crimes. But Thomas says, hey, that's part of the U.S. Code that is focused on the FBI, not the separate chapter on U.S. attorneys. And so therefore, I think the whole thing is unconstitutional. And as in so many instances, I see Thomas's logic, but I can also just imagine just the other conservatives, especially John Roberts, saying, oh, my God, Clarence, really? Again? But anyway, I thought it was worth pointing out because it's not a crazy argument. But in the end, even if it might be convincing from just a textualist standpoint, I think from a practical standpoint, probably at this point, the other conservatives, except for maybe a leader, are just rolling their eyes and like, oh, my God, Clarence, again. So I don't know what you thought about that concurrence.
Yeah, it's funny because for all of Justice Sotomayor's concern about king-like power, Justice Thomas's concurrence was the one that actually was addressing the king-like power that the founders broke from. So in our system, the king cannot, or the president cannot, like a king, create offices. The president, the executive branch, can only fill offices, and that's a limitation on the executive amassing too much power. So, you would think that if we're concerned about excessive presidential power, then that would be something that Justice Sotomayor should think about or care about, but of course not. And I don't know what I think about this. I this whole separation of powers issue, sometimes I just it's hard for me to care more about separation of powers than Congress. Congress always has the opportunity to correct an executive that seems to be getting too much power through its, funding mechanisms, and Congress just doesn't. And it's so frustrating. So I'm glad Justice Thomas is thinking about this, but I wish that we had some senators and representatives thinking about this as well. But it is relevant because it is one of the challenges that's being brought against Jack Smith in the Mar-a-Lago documents case, is that Jack Smith is not, validly in his role. So there, in a sense, there's something good about Justice Thomas weighing in here, because lower courts do need some guidance. They are thinking through these issues. So, okay, that's good. But then again, there's something bad about that, because it's one justice writing alone. So does that mean that there are 8 justices who disagree with that? And so it actually doesn't give the lower courts any guidance. But it is interesting.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason why the other justices didn't want to get into that is because they didn't need to address that issue to resolve the case before them. And so I think Justice Thomas, sometimes I think you can make a case, especially from a conservative standpoint, that he's right on the textualist, sort of straightforward interpretation, but oftentimes, even if you're right, doesn't necessarily have anything to do with addressing the case before you. And he sometimes wants to go beyond that to make a larger point about the court's jurisprudence. And we've seen that again and again. And so he can be sort of a conservative maximalist in kind of a strange way. But I think in the end, my take on this decision is that the majority kind of wanted to have it both ways. In other words, that they wanted to ensure that presidents weren't reluctant to use their legal authority for, fear of post-presidency prosecution, but they also didn't want to give presidents blanket immunity. And so they wrote this opinion that I don't think it was a very clear or well-written opinion, and that's because of what they were trying to do was inherently difficult, and they put in enough ambiguous language to allow them to basically say, in my reading, hey, you can prosecute him for things on a case-by-case basis. We'll be the decider. And that's where Justice Jackson said, well, I don't like it. We shouldn't be the decider. We should just let the court system work its way through. And, I'm sort of torn on this, because I think there really is a balance you need to strike. And I don't know if the court struck the right one. I'm not entirely comfortable with it, but I do believe it is not the end of democracy as we know it. I do not have fear for our democracy because of this decision, unlike Justice Sotomayor.
So one question of maybe some of your thoughts on Inside Baseball, but since Justice Kagan, who was a longtime Harvard professor and the dean of Harvard Law School, is, I think, understood to be the best writer among the Democrats, and in my opinion, the best thinker, persuader, or not of the Democrats, the Democrat appointed justices.
Yeah, sure.
So why was this dissent written by Justice Sotomayor rather than Justice Kagan? Because it is a big deal, I guess. And you would think that you'd have your sort of top dog write it. Is it just Justice Sotomayor wanted it so badly? Or is it that Justice Kagan just she wants to preserve the crazy, not be seen as crazy? What do you think was going on there?
I mean, I don't know that there's exactly much of a seniority argument here, although Sotomayor is slightly senior to Kagan by, I think, like a year or so. But yeah, I think it's probably, if I had to guess, it would be that she just wanted it a lot more, and probably, at least based on the tone of her dissent, she was awfully fired up about it. And so I think in that sense is probably, to me, the best explanation for it. Though, again, I feel like it does a lot more harm than good, because I thought it was so over the top, and I characterized it as reckless earlier, and I'll stand behind that. And so, yeah, I thought it was very, at the very least, unhelpful, and I was disappointed in it. Like I said, I thought that Justice Jackson's dissent made many of the same points without being nearly as hyperbolic and over the top. And I thought it was actually a fairly reasonable, well-argued dissent, and I would have preferred that that be the one that the two other justices in dissent would have joined. All right. Well, let's see. It'll be a while before we hear about the Trump New York case. And as I mentioned, I think the hearing was, I said, postponed until sometime in December. But we'll see how that goes. And until then, why don't we move on to yet another Supreme Court case in our attempt to catch up with everything that the court did in the end of its term. And again, this involves Donald Trump, at least indirectly, and January 6th. And I will once again defer to you and let you bring us up to speed on that one.
All right. So in Fisher versus United States, this is a case involving January 6ers. So there are more than 1,400 defendants that are charged in connection with January 6th, but more than 300 of them are facing charges under 18 USC 1512. And that provision says that whoever corruptly alters, destroys, mutilates, or conceals a record, document, or other object, or attempts to do so with the intent to impair that object's integrity or availability for use in an official proceeding, or who otherwise obstructs, influences, or impedes any official proceeding or attempts to do so, shall be fined or imprisoned. Okay. So these are people who are charged with otherwise obstructing or impeding an official proceeding, right? They charged into the Capitol. But it's weird because Section 1512 says whoever corruptly alters, destroys, or mutilates a record, or who otherwise attempts to impede an official proceeding is going to go to jail. So, does otherwise obstructs mean that it has to be in relation to the record? Because that seems to be what the statute is about, is like destroying a record. Or is otherwise obstructs, influence, or impedes everything? Is it just everything? So anything that interferes with an official proceeding. The government's position was the broader one, that it doesn't have to be connected to destroying some sort of record. And the defendants, obviously, their position is that it does have to be connected to destroying some sort of record thing, object. And the Supreme Court, written by Chief Justice Roberts, said that this otherwise obstructs language does have to be read in light of the statute, in light of the prior point. And I just want to read one of the things that Justice Roberts said in order to explain that. So he says, to see why, consider a straightforward example. A zoo might post a sign that reads, "Do not pet, feed, yell, or throw objects at the animals or otherwise disturb them." If a visitor eats lunch in front of a hungry gorilla or talks to a friend near its enclosure, has he obeyed the regulation? Surely yes. Although the smell of human food or the sound of voices might well disturb the gorillas, the specific examples of impermissible conduct all involve direct interaction with and harassment of the zoo animals. And so that's kind of the principle that they were trying to say here, which is where you have a list of specific things that the statute is about, and then you've got a broadening at the end. It's to get more activity. Does that more activity have to be connected to something? And the Supreme Court said, yes, it did. And honestly, the district court in this case had that narrow reading. The appeals court had the broader reading. So it's not even like the lower courts were unified. And Merrick Garland said he was disappointed, but said that, basically things are going to move forward. There are a lot of defendants here and they're charged with other things. So yeah, that's that. I guess one interesting thing is that Justice Jackson also would have narrowly read this criminal law, whereas Justice Barrett would have more broadly read the law. And even though that's kind of the traditional makeup, is that in general, I think, conservative leaning justices give a lot of leeway to the prosecution versus more liberal justices give less leeway to the prosecution. Here, that is flipped with the exception of Justice Jackson and Justice Barrett, who kind of stuck to more traditional pro or anti-prosecution. But Mike, were you a narrow or were you a broad reading of U.S. Section 1512 here?
As a general, again, this is my overall philosophy: is that a court should give the benefit of the doubt whenever they can to the person the state is attempting to prosecute. I think that's a view that goes all the way back to the founders, and so therefore that almost always means I am a narrow interpreter. I think in Justice Jackson's concurrence, she gets it just right. She writes, "It beggars belief that Congress would have inserted a breathtakingly broad, first-of-its-kind criminal obstruction statute in the midst of a significantly more granular series of obstruction prohibitions without clarifying its intent." I mean, this to me is an easy one. And I think I just didn't even hardly understand Justice Barrett's dissent. She said, okay, the statute's clear. It sure is. But the idea that you can read a segment of the statute entirely disconnected from where it's part of the U.S. code just strikes me as being a bizarre way to look at the law. You use the example of, that Chief Justice Roberts gave. So to me, that's like, if that's what you're arguing is textualism, you don't really understand what textualism is. And to me, it's just such an incredible misunderstanding of how one interprets laws, just discarding the context entirely, that it's almost head scratching to me that you could reach that conclusion. And so that's kind of where I am at that. So I think the majority got it right on this. I certainly would have gone that way. And I don't really think that there are that many political consequences, honestly, in that, there are, I think Attorney General Garland said there are no cases in which the department charged the January 6th defendant only with that offense. Now, I know there are a couple of Donald Trump's charges are related to that, but in the end, I think this is a good decision. I think it's something that courts should do as a general thing, is saying, well, let's interpret this statute narrowly in a way that makes it harder to prosecute people. Because again, even though I think what a lot of these January 6 people did should constitute a crime, just because I don't like what they did doesn't mean I want to make it easier for the state to prosecute anyone. Because today it's the January 6 people. Tomorrow, maybe it's, a Black Lives Matter or an anti-Trump rally. So I'm really uncomfortable with anything that gives the state, that makes it easier for the state to go after people.
Yeah, I guess I'm particularly concerned about the broadening of, like, the federalization of crime too, because prosecuting crime is sort of bread and butter state functions, and whether a state wants to give broad or narrow prosecution of, broaden its crimes, narrow its crimes, that each state can kind of do what they want. But when you have massive federal power and the FBI and the DOJ, and you're saying that Congress, in all of their ineptitude, can just create broad laws that you're going to read unhinged to any context, and then and just let the government go free, that doesn't look like how our country should look. Like, that type of police power should not be, in my opinion, in the hands of the federal government. So I think even for somebody who isn't sure whether they want to give the prosecution broad or narrow authority, I think in the federal context, narrowing it is even more important to me, because it's sort of general police power should remain with the states, and the less federalization of crime, for me, the better.
Although in this case, I mean, given where the crime took place, I think it had to be a federal crime. But this idea of we'll just throw anything that might remotely be you might remotely have done that we could make some kind of bizarro argument that you did. I have a big problem with that, whether it's being done by the federal government or state or local governments. So as a general rule, but it occurs to me, May, that we have largely agreed on pretty much everything today. And I feel like I'm somehow letting down my side. I'm making a lot of flack for that. But, I think, it's important for folks on the left to understand that I'm not seeing this through the lens of what is going to be most effective at keeping Donald Trump down. Though certainly I think another Trump presidency would be horrible, not an existential threat to democracy, but pretty darn bad. But to me, I try to take the bigger view, saying that, well, what do I think the proper role of the government is in general? And if I'm okay with using the government to go after my political opponents, what's going to prevent my political opponents from doing the same thing? And then it becomes really, really ugly really quickly. And so the lawfare that I might be okay when it's going against the people I hate or whatever is, why aren't they going to use it against me? And that, to me, that's a horrible road to go down. I think we've already gone too far down that road, which is why I think it's really important to not see these cases just through the lens of how is it going to help or hurt me in the immediate future, but what does it mean for the country in the next decade or 2 decades or even longer than that? I think not enough people do that sort of thing.
Well, that's because apparently you do not suffer from Trump derangement syndrome, but I think that is a real problem. Trump is obviously a divisive figure for a lot of reasons. I don't think he started it necessarily. I think he's a reaction more so than just divisive out of nowhere. But for some reason, I do think that there is this sense that even if you are in general a pro defendants' rights type of person, it's just, it leaves your mind when it comes to Donald Trump. Or even if you're a big presidential power person, whatever it is, reducing king-like power, whatever it is, when it comes to Donald Trump, and maybe it's Republicans in general, maybe it's Donald Trump in particular, but it does seem, as you said, hard cases make bad law, bad facts make bad law, but Donald Trump in particular risks changing the rules for everything that, I think you're right, are going to have consequences for decades to come that I really hope people think through.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we've come to the end of this weekend show, but we still have a lot of Supreme Court stuff to talk about, at least a couple of big cases. The Grants Pass versus Johnson on the homeless encampment case. There's a decision from out of Texas and Florida about their rules that put restrictions on social media, censorship, and we want to get to that. We also want to talk about that Heritage Foundation Project 2025 mandate for leadership, and we're going to get to all of that in our midweek show. So if you are a supporter, you're going to get the full thing. If you're not a supporter, we hope you'll consider becoming one so you can get the full midweek show, get ad-free versions. You know the spiel by now. So spiel, God, how old am I? Anyway, you know the shtick by now, whatever. It's a lot of malarkey. I'm going to shut up now. But we hope you'll consider it, and you'll find links to become a supporter in the show notes, as always. And if you want to get the full midweek show, but you're not in a position to financially support us right now, there are a bunch of people who are in that position. I'm happy to help you out and get that show to you. Just send me an email. I'm mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get that taken care of. And whether you're a supporter or not, it really does help us out if you subscribe, if you haven't already, and if you rate, review us on whatever podcast app you're listening to us on, as well as sharing episodes on social media. That is a big deal for us. And finally, before we go, as always, a very special thanks to our wonderful executive producers. They are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,